Okay, so getting back into it, let's let Richmond give us the thumbs up, thumbs down. Y'all seeing us? RVA. Let me know when you do. There were a couple people who unfortunately missed out on this morning's recap. The good news is that just talking with Balance, and I have to talk with Harper about this. Being the CTO, he knows all things technical, and he's going to be able to say whether or not we can do this. Just got the thumbs up from Richmond. But all of the streaming sessions are streamed through YouTube. And I think it automatically records all of it, which would be excellent to be able to share. Now, I don't think we have it shared with anybody right now, but if that's the case, and we're going to look into it, we have that. So this morning specifically, maybe not some of the stuff early in the week, but we've kind of recapped everything up to jQuery, and we're about to go through jQuery now. So we're going to see if we can share that with particular people or even make it public, but I'm not going to promise anything. We got to see how that is. That way you can go back and like fast forward, look at the code, you know, see what I said then. Hopefully that'll, those who unfortunately due to bad directions or whatnot, thanks Ballant, those people don't have to miss out. And I know some people have some personal issues that they weren't able to be here this morning. If there's anybody in Richmond like that, we'll see what we can do for you. Yep, exactly what you saw up there. It records the sound and the screens, everything. So, okay, so we've gone through this morning HTML, CSS, and talked a little bit about JavaScript, the language, and we talked about the browser just being another container for JavaScript, but it doesn't have to be caged just inside of a browser. We're going to learn later that you can use Node.js, and you can do things with real systems, not just in the browser. So JavaScript is actually our first language and a very important one because I said earlier, you can use it to talk with APIs around the world. Pretty much any modern API is going to talk JSON. And JSON is just, remember the object, actually let's do it. I don't have to talk about it. We can write code. So everybody here, this is the example we finished up with right before lunch. And we did old school. We didn't have any jQuery. This is just straight HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And to recap, what we've got here is we've got a little on click. And rather than write all our code inside of there, because that's kind of nasty and it's hard to read, we said, let's create a little function. And a function is just nothing more than a bundle of code that we put a name on. Just like a variable is nothing more than a box with a name on it, the name of the variable, a function is nothing more than a bundle of code with a name on it. So we created that bundle of code up here. How do you do that in JavaScript? The function keyword. Function, give it a name. That's how we're going to talk about it later. So that's, notice this nice little editor. I highlight a word, and it automatically says, oh, you want to find that somewhere else in the same document? And it highlights it for me. So right there is where we're calling that function name. What did we do here? We said, I want to go find that text box with that ID, and I'm going to get the value out of it. And I'm going to take that value, and I'm going to feed it into another function called parseFloat in this case. That says take a string. A string is what? A string of characters. And convert it to a number. What type of number? Float is floating point number, which means expect some significant digits possibly to the right of the decimal. So it's a decimal number maybe. Int, integer is always a whole number. It's not always positive, it could be negative, but it's whole. It doesn't have significant digits to the right of the decimal. There are only about 5 or 6 different data types in JavaScript. So fairly straightforward. We've learned about strings. Strings are everywhere. We've learned about 2 different types here. One is an integer, another is a float, floating point number. They're both numbers. There's another one called Boolean. Boolean is one of those mathematician PhD words that means true or false. So it's just 0 or 1, Very, very small variable, very efficient. And in JavaScript, there are only two values, the word true or false. And in JavaScript, it's case sensitive, and it has to be all lowercase. That's all you need to know about Booleans. So what is a Boolean for? A Boolean, we talked about the fancy word called conditional. And conditionals are when you have an if statement and you need to make a decision. That's not real code. I'm just saying that is where you put your something, some code that evaluates to either true or false, and it has to. So why do we do that? If I did this, so we've declared a variable, my bool, and I set it to a value of true. If I do my bool here, and how do I open? Remember, opening and closing is very important in developing. Not just JavaScript, not just HTML, CSS, everything. Computers are not smart. You have to tell them start and end. And in between there, you do what you're going to do. So how do we open an if statement in JavaScript?
Curly brace.
Curly brace. And I typed curly open, and this editor is smart enough to know I'm talking JavaScript here, and it automatically closed it for me. Help me out. Otherwise, I would just had to type it. That's what I normally do. That's what you should probably normally do, is do your start and end, and then right in here you can write more code. This code on line 12 will only happen if that conditional is true. And this is the simplest possible condition. Actually, I'm not. You can say this. If true, you can hard code the value of true. That is the simplest possible conditional. That means it's not really a switch anymore. It just, you're always going to do that. There's no reason to ever do this. My bool, if you look at the code, that's going to be set to true. It's always going to go through here. So you don't really need an if statement. Why do you need an if statement? Because sometimes it may not be true. That's why it's called conditional. It depends on the condition whether or not you go this path, or you skip it, or you go another path. So let's break that down a little bit. We've learned about concatenation, and let's use a little bit of that concatenation here. So instead of just an alert, we've got a very simple conditional, talking a little bit about data types. By the way, we haven't talked explicitly about data types. What is a data type? Can somebody explain to the rest of us?
Like an integer or a string or like you said a boolean.
Just Chris spoke up and said just like an integer or a string or a bool, or there's a date time. Like I said, there's only 5 or 6. And if you open up a JavaScript book or you go through a JavaScript tutorial online, they're going to spend half an hour, an hour talking about data types. And that is so boring I can't bring myself to do it. Okay? All you need to know about data types is there are like 5 or 6 of them. In JavaScript, they're inferred. So see this var? In other languages like C#, you could say, I want you to be an integer, or I want you to be a double floating point number, double precision. You can do that in other languages. You can't even do that in JavaScript because it's a loosely typed language. So data types exist, but in JavaScript, they're inferred. For now, that's really all you need to know. A Boolean is really, at the end of the day, what the stuff in an if statement resolves down to. You normally don't just look at one variable. You look at a conditional. You make a decision with it. So in this case, let's make it so that if the sum of n1 and n2, the first number and the second number that we've asked the user to enter, is greater than 100, we're going to do something different. Let's start there. So who can help me out? So at this point, what have we done? That's getting the value from the text box, converting it to a number, and storing it in a variable called n1. This is getting the value from the text box identified by ID what? What's the ID of that second text box? Number dash 2. And we're saying getting the value inside of there, and then convert it, do the stuff inside the parentheses first, convert it to an integer. So we're making it a number. What type of number? A number with no decimals. integer. Throw it into this variable called n2 that we're declaring right there. So in JavaScript, the way you declare new variables is just var. What are we doing then? We say, well, let's go look in the boxes that we just filled with some numbers, and let's add them together. So whatever they entered, they're numbers now because we converted them. Add them together, and then look at the equal sign, throw it on the left-hand side. What are we doing with it? Throw it into that text box, identified by the ID of result. Once again, my editor's helping me out. ID of result down here. Nothing big here. Now, that's going to happen. I'm not changing any of that. Let's make it so that if their two numbers added together is greater than 100, I want to actually change the background of the body to be black. Makes no sense. We're just playing around here. So how do you do that? We have an if statement. We already opened and closed it. All we have to do is right inside the parentheses here, decide what to do.
N1 plus N2 equals.
You said greater than?
I said if it's greater than 100, so that's what we're trying to do here. So it's just the greater than sign. 100. Yeah. Now, because we're doing a calculation here inside of the conditional, normally what you do is you'd store n1 and n2 in another variable so it's clean to look at. You wouldn't do the calculation right here in line. It'll work, but just to keep things very straightforward, let's create another variable. And I'm going to put the other variable right here. Numeric result. I could say n3 or x003, but then other developers are going to say, what in the world was he smoking that day? So we're going to do the same calculation that we had here. And we have the variable value in numeric result. What type of variable? Think of data type as the flavor of the variable. They're all variables, they're all boxes, but there's a flavor to that box. And they're going to behave different ways when you use them. You can store different things in them. So numeric result, what type of variable is that going to be? It's going to be an integer. Or, no, in this case, I didn't mean to trip you up, but it's not going to be an integer because we have one of them is going to be a float. So because the rule in JavaScript is like, well, if you have an integer and you have a float, it's going to say, give me the worst possible case. If you add a 3 to a 3.14, you're going to come out with 6.14. So you could have a floating point. So it's going to give you a floating point, but you got the idea. So it's numeric result. That's going to be a float. It's a number. It doesn't really matter. So now we don't have to do the calculation in the conditional. Once again, this is another example of code reuse. Before we talked about in CSS this morning, don't just put it in the style tag. Put it at the top so you can write it once rather than twice or 10 times. Here, I created a variable just instinctively. And I'd created instinctively because I saw us doing this calculation, n1 plus n2. And do I want to write that calculation out more than one time? No. No. It makes it less readable. It's a waste of typing. So let's create a little variable. You see code reuse and dry. Don't repeat yourself. Basic principles of good coding. So what are we going to put here instead of the calculation? Numeric result. Because we already did it. We put it into a box. So that's going to be the result that we already calculated on line 9. We're going to reuse it down here. We can do that same thing somewhere else. Where are we going to do it? Line 10. We don't have to do that here either because we have it in the box already. Not only is that cleaner, it's code reuse, but it's going to be faster. Here, it doesn't make a bit of difference. But if you have large, complicated calculations that eat up CPU, you don't want to do that more than once. You want to do that calculation, take the result, put it in a variable, keep it in the box, and then just look in the box. If you copied and pasted that very heavy, complicated calculation 3 or 4 times, all of a sudden you have a slow system. And people wonder why. Well, the code runs, but it's slow. It's because you have lazy developers that didn't dry up their code. So we've got numeric result. That's got the box. We're not redoing the calculation. It just remembered whatever the result was. And then we reuse that result. Just look in the box. Look in the box. And now we're comparing. Look in the box, see what's in there. Is it greater than 100? If it's greater than 100, we're going to change the background of the body to black. How do you do that? No jQuery. We have to do it the old school way. It's the background color. Exactly right. It's the background color of what HTML element? It's the body. So, document, and I'm completely guessing here. I think it's that. Like I said, I just do jQuery to do this stuff in the browser. I couldn't tell you really. So this may or may not work. We got a 50-50 chance. We're going to make it black. How do you say black?
0, 0, 0.
You could just say 3 if you want, because shorthand.
You can't just say black.
You can. You can. Yeah. You could say black. Okay? And that's more readable. Sometimes that's better. Okay, so I'm not going to use the mouse. I am going to use Control S. I just did Control S. And I'm going to go slow. So Control S and set the background color. We're only going to set that. You know, it's going to be kind of jarring to the user if all of a sudden it turned black and they have no idea why, because they're not going to understand how to read the code. So we might as well tell them this is what we just did. And I'm going to try to do something that I have no clue how to do. I did it like once 18 years ago. Let's guess. And this is what it looks like when you don't have code that works. I'm going to try to set the little message on the bottom of the browser status bar, the bottom right-hand corner. It was cool in the late 1990s to actually animate that so you can actually see the stuff. If you're old enough, you remember that those days where they used to put the little text that would move around the bottom. This is how they did it. They just changed that and they had it in a little loop. That's been so long ago, I couldn't tell you the syntax for that. So I think it's something like, somebody look it up, Google it and help me. Body.status or something, or window.status is equal to, you just entered a very large number. This isn't going to be exactly functional because let's think this through. Once again, it's not about math. It's about logic. It's about common sense. So let's think about how this works step by step. We already know that we're going to ask the user to enter information into 2 text boxes. They're going to click a button. That button is going to run a function right here, add 2 numbers. When they click the button, because this on-click thing, it's going to go line by line. 7, 8, 9, 10. We know what that does. It calculates the number, puts it in the text box. We're all good. Now we have some new code here. If the number that we calculated is greater than 100, we're going to do this stuff. Life is good. That's going to work as long as, you know, once somebody helps me out with the right syntax there.
That's, you got it right.
Really? Wow. Okay. We'll see. We'll see. Okay, cool. Thanks for looking that up. I get lucky sometimes. So that's all well and good. It's going to do that. But then what happens if they change the numbers and they click the button again? It's still going to be black, and it's still going to have that little status message at the bottom that says you entered a very large number, which isn't true anymore. So how do we clean that up? How do we make it so that if they change the numbers, then it's going to clear it back? It's going to put the background color back to white, which is the default, and it's going to get rid of that status message. Else. There's a method to my madness here. So let's walk through this. If the result is greater than 100, we're going to set the background color to black. We're going to add that status message. What do we want to do if it's not greater than 100? So we're going to do almost the same thing. Somebody actually said it, but I couldn't make it out because they didn't speak it very loud. We're going to set it to white. What are we going to do to status? No status. We just set it back to blank. Okay. Now the next challenge, I'm going to do Control S here. I'm anxious to see if this actually works. Sometimes you can't trust the internet. So, okay. So, good news. No No error messages. If I did, I'd have a little red message up there. So far so good. Now, one thing before we proceed, I need to figure out how to show the status bar because nobody uses that little thing anymore. And you see, I have nothing down at the bottom. So I have no clue how to show that.
You need to full-size your screen and then move it up.
That is like that.
And then maybe I don't know.
Okay.
That's my guess.
Well, we can leave it like that. Let's settings maybe. No, that's going to be Chrome settings. Huh. One of y'all Google that and figure it out because we're going to actually have code running hopefully.
Oh, there's no status bar in Chrome. The old tool strip on that. Eliminated.
Okay, Internet Explorer, does it have one? Firefox?
It says you
Maybe.
can do it.
Yeah. Oh, you can change it? You can add it? Tell me how to do that. Settings.
Settings, advanced settings. System.
They really don't want you to do this. System.
System, uncheck the box next to use hardware acceleration.
Really? Okay. And then I've got to, I guess, reopen it. Let's see. We'll see if we can trust the internet today. Maybe not.
Did you read lunch?
I did, yeah. Let's try Internet Explorer. Obviously, I've never opened this.
There's reason.
Okay, so up here, I'm pretty sure status bar. There we go. I guess IE is good for something. Oh. Doesn't trust my own code. Okay. So let's see if it works in Internet Explorer. So we're going to enter 3 and 7, add 2 numbers. It works. Now, we didn't get anything happen because we didn't exceed 100. So and what do you know? You just entered a number larger than 100. Now, we were thinking through this like a good developer. Set it back. Is it going to change it back? It does. Okay. So, there are lots of little things out there, and as David liked to say, he's forgotten more than y'all have learned so far. It's true. A lot of them are obscure things that I wish I could forget, like Windows status. I don't need to know that. Apparently, Chrome doesn't even have it anymore. So this is just one more way to do something. The point here was the if statement. So the if statement here and the conditional, to talk technically just a second, that can be very complex. That can be, how do you say or in JavaScript? Bar. So now it looks crazy, but when you see that in a developer's mind, think or. It's not just in JavaScript. That is identical to what you're going to see in C#. So if I wanted to say, so what do I mean by or? So or, what else? Okay. Or my first number entered, the first text box, is greater than 30. Okay, let's make it a little bit more nuanced. What does that mean? Greater than or equal to. So if n1 is 30, then this will still be true. Now, this is where the truth tables, this is where people that scared you away from software development until now, this is what they were talking about. Basics of logic, truth tables, you got to put things together. So, evaluate that to true, a Boolean value. True or false, there's only 2 options. Do it step by step. Numeric result greater than 100, it's either going to be true or false, okay? Or, we're going to say n1, which is the first number, greater than or equal to 30. Now, what this is going to resolve to, you have a true or false. That's going to give you a true. A true or true, true. False or false. False. Or means if either one, anything I'm comparing is true or true. But you have to have at least one. Now, how do you say and? There's really only two options here, or and. Ampersand, ampersand. That's all that means. When you see it from now on, as a developer, as you are, ampersand, ampersand means and. Okay? So I'm teaching you about some of the syntax of conditionals, which we completely glossed over. But it's important because you learn them now. You're going to use them in Ruby, Elixir, JavaScript like what we're doing, C#, Fortran, you name it. All of them use almost exactly this syntax. That's why developers, when they think that they know so much, it's actually they learned it once, and they learned, oh, this language does it exactly the same way, and they feel really smart. Okay. It's almost exactly the same thing. Visual Basic and Microsoft, they do things a little bit different. That's how they say it, or. They actually type it out, and, okay? This doesn't really make sense in our example. We can leave it just to show you that it works. So this is going to be if the sum of the numbers added together is greater than 100, or the first number is greater than or equal to 30. I'm going to save that. Now I have to change the status message to be appropriate. So it actually takes more words to say that than just to write it. So hence maybe the acronyms that developers like. So I'm going to flip back over here to Internet Explorer. We'll do this again. And we're going to do a 38 and a 2. Are we going to turn black background? Yes. Because number 1 was greater than 30. When developers talk about edge cases, it's right on the cusp. We're going to put it at 30. Is that going to turn black? I said greater than or equal, and it is equal. So yeah, it says true. We're good. 29? Nope. Okay? But we can make it turn black by turning this on. So go over 100. So either way, it's going to turn it black. So that's how conditionals work, and that's an if-else. So we're building it back up. These are some of the things we glossed over earlier in the week. And I'm spending a little bit more time on JavaScript. We're going to get to jQuery for some of you that's like, okay, let's get back to where we were yesterday. We're almost there. But some of the things that we've glossed over are very, very important. If statements, else, functions, variables. We talked about down here. Why do you put the buttons there? Why do you actually have 2 input boxes? That's where you have to take a step back and you got to use some logic. That is the common sense of programming. You got to think step by step. My wife actually used to be a programmer. She hates this stuff, so she got out of it as soon as she could. She can do it, she just doesn't like it. To each his own. So she used to say, she was talking to me about, you should give them this example. It's like, they're not going to understand what you're talking about, Claudia. This is the example she wanted to share, and it's appropriate here, so I'll share it. She said, you know what a programmer, and she actually wanted me to use this in the interview, to ask you, how do you get up in the morning? That's it. She said, listen to their response. If they're a programmer, they're going to probably tell you step by step how they get up in the morning. Well, I open my eyes, and I roll down the sheets, and I take my right leg, and I step it outside of the bed, and I kind of shift my weight up on my right foot, and then I take my left leg. It's like, okay. So that is how a programmer, unfortunately, needs to think. Obviously, in real life, we don't do that. But she said, if they give you that answer, they're going to be the next superstar. Because they're just born to do this stuff. It's not math. It's step-by-step common sense. Relate it to this. if you need to create a user interface, the boss comes to you and says, I need a user interface that allows people to add two numbers. Go do it. Rather than being lost, think like the computer. Think step by step. Plan it out. What do I need to do first? Well, in order to add two numbers, I got to have the numbers. How do I do that? Well, I know HTML. I got a text box. Let me give them a text box. If you want to do something else, there's something else called prompt, which is a little pop-up box, kind of like the alert, where you let them type something in and you get the result. Nobody ever uses that because it's a really ugly little box. Text boxes in jQuery UI, which we'll see. There are different ways of capturing data. But at the end of the day, you have to get those two numbers somehow. Then you have to wait. You have to wait for them to tell you they're ready to calculate. You have to have a button, or you have to have some indication that they're ready. That's what the button's for. Now, it's all well and good you do the calculation. Where are you going to put it? You got to plan out some place to put it. What's another option to display the result versus this input read-only, this result? What's another option? What could we do to tell the user what the result was? We could do an alert. What's another way? Console log, but the only developers going to look in the console. You're not going to see that on screen.
Create new element.
We could create a brand new element, create a p tag and put it in the page. Yeah. We could have a div down there that's empty, and we just put the value in the div, so all of a sudden it shows up. There are all kinds of ways. That's the creativity. Do it however you want. Change the colors, change the borders, do whatever you want. That's some of the fun of programming. So, okay. So, everybody understand conditionals? Everybody good on that? Let me check on Richmond.
What does the else lead to?
What does the else lead to? So the syntax for the else is from there to there. It's just like the if. You have to open and close it. And it says else from here to here, do that bundle of code. That could be as many lines of code as I want. So it's like a fork in the road. Do I go the first road or the second? That's the way you read this. Now, let's talk a little bit about arrays and for loops and objects. Those are, as David would put it, the big boy variables. They're useful because in the real world, you use them all the time. Because in the real world, it's not often that you use a single variable here or there. You're dealing with larger amounts of data. So in order to keep that larger amounts of data and pass it around, you bundle it up. An object is nothing more than a bundle of other variables. That's it. So if we wanted to create, let's do it. It doesn't really make sense here because we don't need one. But let's create a variable here that is an object made up of two properties, two variables. Properties is a fancy word that means it's a variable that belongs to an object. Okay? You remember that because in C# it's the same thing. Ruby, same thing. Elixir, same thing. A property is a variable that belongs to an object. So let's create one. Whenever we create a variable, what's the keyword? JavaScript. Var. What are we going to name this? This is going to be a bundle of numbers. Okay? How do you create an object? It's a curly brace. So curly brace, in this case, I know it's confusing because even JavaScript uses curly brace to mean start and end of if statements, start and end of functions. It also uses it to mean start and end of an object variable. Okay? So we're creating a brand new object variable. That, actually I can remove that. That is perfectly valid. That means create me a brand new object that is empty, has nothing in it. It's not very useful, but it's valid. So now, in order to make it useful, we need to give it some properties. What are properties? Variables that belong to the object. So how do you define that? We just say first number, and then we say we're going to use the variable up here, n1. And that is a valid object. That alone. Now, I want to stop here and make sure everyone's cool with the syntax. So bundle of numbers, That's an object variable. I'm declaring it on line 9. I'm setting it equal to, how do I know it's an object variable? That. That means I'm declaring an object. Remember the CSS syntax where you have the colon to say this is what it's equal to? When you're talking about JavaScript objects, you do it exactly the same way. So we're saying property, and you can either put this in double quotes or single quotes if you want, just to make sure, okay, that's the name of my variable. No problem. It works either way. You have to do it like this. When? Think about this for a second. You've seen a lot of strings so far. When do I have to specify the variable or the property name in double quotes or single quotes? Think about the computer.
When it's inside parentheses?
No, if it's in other quotes, you can't.
Not when it's in other quotes, but how does the computer know when a string is one thing or multiple things? You put delimiters around it. Why do you have to put delimiters around it? Because if you have a space in there, the computer assumes you're done, unless it knows you're inside of something. So if I had first space number, I could call it, that's a valid property. That's a name of variable. It's not clean. I wouldn't do it. That's why you have to actually type more stuff to name something with spaces in it. Access developers, we'll get to you. When it comes to the database stuff, Access developers are horrible about this. They name their fields with spaces in it. It's like, okay, I'll get to that. That's another tirade. Okay, we're not going to do that. I'm going to show you that you could do that. Like right here, you could do that. Same thing. Don't be afraid of the different syntax. We're going to have two properties, not just one. So to have more than one property, how do you define that? Go ahead and guess. Doesn't hurt. Space is a good guess. Good guess. Plus a good guess. Not right, but comma. I heard it. Okay. Stevenson's going to get there. We're going to get there eventually. Okay? There you go. Pause here. This is extremely important. Not just for JavaScript, not just for this page or today's example. You need to understand what an object is, because when Derek comes in and he's talking to you about C# and classes and object-oriented inheritance and passing around pointers, and he's gonna go. He doesn't go fast. You don't have to worry about that. He's going to introduce some complex concepts, and he's actually going to be. I'm not going to give it away. He's going to be good. He's very different from me and David now. So, first number, second number. Why is this important? Because objects are how the real programming world works. You need to be able to nest objects if you want to. I'll show you this. It doesn't make any sense in this case, but now, starting to get a headache. And I could write it like that. Now it's looking a little scary. That looks scary to me. It's like, okay, what are they doing here? They're making things needlessly complex. What have I done? Step by step. We have variables. We're good. We got two little boxes. We put a label on those boxes of N1 and N2. Okay, we're going to put those boxes, little boxes, in a bigger box. And we're going to put a label on the bigger box of bundle of numbers. Then we took that bigger box and we put it in another bigger box. And we called it our nested object. All of that to make our lives more difficult. So how do I talk about N1? Somebody help me out. How do I actually get the poor little variable value out of the smallest box in these two bigger boxes? Think about the hierarchy. It's very much like CSS selectors. You start at the top level. So what is our top level here? It's called our nested object. To go down in, this is JavaScript object notation. Remember this morning I pointed out on the UI, on the visual? It's called JSON because it's an object definition, JavaScript object notation. This is how you can specify very complex data structures that have no real structure. You can declare it on the fly. So our nested object dot is how you go down. You see in the patterns in programming, in paths, how do you go down if you're on Windows? Backslash. If you're on Linux and you're going down, /. If you're in CSS and you're going inside, space. You say it differently, but the concepts are identical. It's all about hierarchies. It's one thing inside of another. So this is JavaScript's version of a hierarchy. We're saying our nested object dot, we're going down. What's the next name? Our first object. And what do you know? My editor is so smart because it actually says it's probably this. Let me help you out. Now, we got the top box. We're inside the second box now, and we want to talk about the first number. How do we talk about the first number? What did we name that variable? N1. It's not N1 here, because when we put the value of N1, we threw it into a box named that. It's first number. Okay? So that's the name of the box, the little box inside the bigger box inside of the bigger box. And that's how you talk about it in JSON. That's all it is. Show you I'm not lying to you. Now, why didn't I need the double quotes here? Because I didn't have any spaces. I'll show you the other way that you can do that. If you do have spaces, it just makes everything more complicated. Please don't do that. But Ruby developers love to do that. Okay, what did I just do there? Yep, I commented all that stuff out because we're not going to use it right now. Right now, instead of all that stuff, when we click the button, it's going to run or add two numbers just like before, but we're going to write out the value of the first number to the console. Okay, so I'm going to save that, Control S, Alt Tab. I'm going to F5, refresh. Okay, everybody with me? Okay, so I'm going to 78, 32. It's not actually going to do anything with the result because we commented out that code. It's dead code right now. But what is it going to do? Oh, Internet Explorer has a developer console tool. Notice that for some reason, Microsoft and Internet Explorer, they just never finish their stuff. Look at that. That's horrible. Come on. Is there any reason for that? Come on. Do better than that. They're trying to be good, but I can't even read that. Give me a break. So let's go. That's console. There we go. Okay. There's a reason we work in Chrome. So we're going to click on Add Two Numbers. 78. I didn't lie to you. Right there it is. That's our first number. Let me switch back over. All this complicated nonsense, why did I do that? To show you the JavaScript object notation. How JSON, an object definition in JavaScript, can be as complicated as you want it to be. Why is that important? Why is JSON the common language of all these application programmer interfaces, APIs? Because sometimes, they actually, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was working on an online credit card processing app. I had to make a little change to it. When you pass the credit card data, like the credit card number and the expiration date and the zip code, talking to authorize.net from C#, what's their API speak? It speaks several languages, but I was using the JSON API, which means they wanted me to create a JavaScript object very much like this and give it to them. I would just send it to them. And that's how I would provide the credit card number and the expiration date. And in exchange, they would say thumbs up or thumbs down. How? They would give me a JSON object back with a variable or two in it that says result, transaction authorization code. This is real world stuff. So I'm teaching it to you with first number, second number, but this could just as easily be account number. expiration dates, and so on. And that's how the real world works with JSON. That's how most of the APIs out there work. So, I told you I was going to show you some crazy syntax, just because, not that you're going to write this code, but other developers will, and you have to understand what they're talking about. So, that's how you can get to an object that doesn't have any spaces in it. But say we did something silly like this. JavaScript is very flexible, very loose. It's going to let you do that. Now the problem is, how in the world am I going to talk about that variable with spaces in it? You can't just say dot, because if we did, let's see what happens. Uh-oh. Even Internet Explorer knows that's an error. It says expected closing paren. I'm going to switch back over. It's like, what in the world is he talking about? Oh, it means this paren right there. It thinks that that is the end of my variable name because there's a space there. It wants me to do that. If I just follow his suggestion, that's completely wrong. Then he's going to complain about what's this silly variable name stuff on the end. That's not really what you mean. So in order to get around that, I have a question. Dave.
Could you underscore that instead of space? Can it still count as one?
Yes, that's actually, the question was, can you put underscores in there instead of space? And yes, absolutely. And that, unfortunately, underscores are kind of hard to type, so people don't often use those. But that is why a lot of developers use underscores, to avoid the spaces, because an underscore counts as connecting words. A dash does too, as long as the language will allow you to use dash. CSS does. I don't think JavaScript will allow you to do a dash unless you do it in a double quote. A lot of languages, for some reason, don't like dashes. They'll let you use underscore but not dash. So, my silly variable name, how do we talk about that? Any ideas?
Percentages.
Camel case would be a nice thing, yeah. That's this, by the way, this format, camel case, why is it called camel case? It has a little hump in the middle. It has a hump whenever you actually change words, but it's still one thing together. So you can make this as long as you want. If you had second number that I wanted to define, if you imagine a little camel and those are the little humps of the camel, that's what that means. That's the JavaScript tradition. There's no reason for that. It's syntactically correct to put it all uppercase if you want, but that's usually, that's one way around it. But we've already made the mistake. Some other developer has spaces in there. How do we deal with that? All good guesses. I heard ellipses, forward slash. It's actually double quote in bracket. So that, I really don't like that because that doesn't look like a variable in an object. That looks like an array, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It does. I just don't like that syntax. It makes things confusing. That's valid. That will work, but that's nasty. And Harper's probably saying, it's not nasty. He's used to it. The more you look at Ruby code, the more you kind of release your inhibitions about nastily formatted code. I'm not a big fan of Ruby. It works. Not pretty, but that's how you get around it. Why did I show you that? Am I being esoteric? No, it's because if we hire you, we're going to show you all kinds of nasty code. And I can't apologize to you for it because we didn't write half of it. You need to understand what it's doing. You need to work around it. And that's what a developer does. You deal with other people's code. You write your own code well, but you don't have control of the whole code base. That's life. You need to understand what this stuff is doing. So, objects. Let's make sure we all understand. So, objects are nothing more than bigger boxes that are contained of variables. Can you nest objects? Sure you can. You can go as many levels deep as you want. You really shouldn't unless you have a good reason. So in this case, we don't have any good reasons. To Tell you what, you all want me to go directly into arrays? You want to take a 5-minute break? What do you all want? 5-minute break? Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back and we'll do for loops and arrays.
Can I get mine 2 times